He had lit her curtains on fire and blocked all her exits. It was a cruel murder with lots of premeditation. Tiernan added that for him, this was an act of mercy, as Mary was suffering from dementia. Have you ever played Truth or Dare? It's usually a pretty innocent game, right? Well, one night in 2021, 19-year-old Tiernan Darton was playing Truth or Dare when he casually confessed to burning his step-grandmother alive when he was 17. What was his motivation, and how did he escape justice for so long? Let's dive into the case of the 17-year-old who confessed to killing his grandma in Truth or Dare. Today's story begins in Heysham, Lincolnshire. It's a serene beach town in the northwest of England. This was the home of Tiernan Darton, who was born on September 19th, 2000. Tiernan grew up with his mom and stepdad, Chris. His biological father had left the family when Tiernan was very young, so Chris was the father he knew for most of his life. Tiernan's family was a pretty tight-knit unit, even though they weren't all related by blood. Tiernan had a good relationship with both his mom and stepdad, but unfortunately, his mental health would start to take a toll on him. When he was 12, Tiernan started struggling with anxiety. The teenage years are the time to make friends and start having a social life of your own. But Tiernan was doing just the opposite. He couldn't talk to strangers, and he didn't want to see his friends either. Soon enough, he didn't want to go to school either. The very thought of walking through those big doors with all eyes on him sent him to a state of panic. Tiernan's family spoke to the school, and eventually they agreed for Tiernan to be homeschooled. This is very rare in the UK. But Tiernan was technically physically able to attend school. He was struggling with depression and anxiety at this point, which were holding him back. But sadly, interacting with friends would have made Tiernan better. Instead, he was locked inside his home with his mom and Chris. So his depression got worse and worse. During his later teens, Tiernan was referred to CAMS, the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services. He saw a psychiatrist and was given some meds to treat his depression as well as his anxiety. It's unclear if Tiernan's therapist gave him the right treatment or if it helped Tiernan at all, but the state-funded CAMS has a history of really bad cases. When he was 16, Tiernan began falling behind his peers, who were passing their GCSEs and heading to college, which is the equivalent of American senior high school. Being homeschooled, Tiernan hadn't passed his GCSE exams. His only option was to go study at a further education college, a type of school that gives any person more employability. Tiernan enrolled to Kendall College in Lincolnshire, but just a few months later he dropped out, only to enroll to Lincolnshire and Moorcabe College in the same area. Soon enough, he dropped out again. Tiernan was not only inconsistent with his studies, he began to act out, raise his voice, and be outright unpleasant with his parents. When he was 17, Tiernan's mom kicked him out of the house. Tiernan had nowhere to go, but someone stepped in and offered him a home. It was Chris's 94-year-old grandmother, Mary Gregory. Mary made it clear that this was a temporary deal for Tiernan until he figured something else out. Mary treated him like an adult, not a child. Soon enough, Tiernan patched up his relationship with his mom, and she welcomed him back home. But he would now spend half of his time at Mary's bungalow whenever he wanted a quieter evening. However, Mary didn't trust Tiernan. Mary's other son, Peter, said he was frequently in Mum's house in the final months leading to Mum's death. She despised and distrusted him and did not want him anywhere near her. Chris thought Mary's distrust was an effect of her dementia and never took it seriously. But something horrifying was about to happen. On May 28, 2018, Chris and Peter received the worst piece of news they could imagine. Mary had been discovered under a table in her smoke-filled home. Her blood-curdling screams had been heard by her neighbors in the dead of night, and the fire brigade was called ASAP. She was covered in burns, and the inside of her mouth was black from all of the smoke she had inhaled. The doctors managed to resuscitate her, but she was on a ventilator in the intensive care unit, fighting for her life. Her 2 sons were in shock at the sight of their very vulnerable mother. Even worse was the story. She had struggled to escape her house, but all the exits had been mysteriously blocked. Mary tried to speak to her sons, but her lungs, throat, and mouth were far too damaged. Watching her try to speak, choking on her words, was truly awful. That is a memory I will never erase from my mind. 4 days later, Mary died in the hospital. Needless to say, her death triggered an investigation. What had caused this horrific death? At first, the answer seemed pretty obvious to the Lincolnshire police. Mary was a 94-year-old woman, so she probably accidentally started the fire herself. Tiernan's family was brought closer together after this tragedy. Mary had died a horrible death, and Chris wanted to give his wife and her son as much love as he could, aware of the frailty of life. But what Chris didn't know was that Tiernan was the one who had killed his mom. He had lit her curtains on fire and blocked all her exits. It was a cruel murder with lots of premeditation. But Tiernan's dark secret would stay hidden for 3 more years, until Tiernan himself would blow his own cover. Tiernan's actions in May 2018 started haunting him. He needed to tell someone about it. In 2019, Tiernan was playing Truth or Dare with a few friends when he picked Truth, and he was asked what his darkest secret was. He said, "I have a secret I haven't told anyone. I may have killed someone." If a friend told you that, would you believe them? Well, Tiernan's friends didn't. But Tiernan insisted he was telling the truth, and even gave them details about it. He had burned his step-grandmother alive in her home. Tiernan asked his confused friends to keep quiet about this, and they did, simply because they thought he was fooling around. But in May 2019, Tiernan started seeing another therapist. He couldn't go to Cam's therapy anymore, as he was now officially an adult, so he was transferred to an adult psychotherapy clinic. Tiernan had a brand new therapist, and he found this to be the perfect opportunity to divulge his secret. He told her, "My friend could send me to prison because of what he knows." Needless to say, the therapist wanted to know what he meant by that. Tiernan told her about the Truth or Dare night and how he divulged his darkest secret. He then added that he felt powerful at an event involving a person who had died. He said, "I knew what had happened, and everyone else in the room didn't." Tiernan was being cryptic, but it seems like he was talking about Mary's funeral. He knew what had happened because he had caused her death, and no one else was aware of it at the time. Finally, the therapy session ended, and Tiernan's therapist wanted to clarify something before he left. "I'm not really clear what you're saying, but I think you're trying to tell me you've killed someone." Tiernan just looked at her and mouthed, "Yes." The therapist didn't immediately notify the police. Instead, she waited for the next session for more details to come out. Indeed, they would. Tiernan came with his stepdad and confessed everything in front of both him and the therapist.
Tiernan Darnton turned to his therapist and his stepfather, and he told them both that the death of his grandmother in that house fire a year prior hadn't actually been that tragic or unexpected to him, because he was the one that started the fire.
Tiernan added that for him, this was an act of mercy, as Mary was suffering from dementia. Chris was in utter shock, but he held it back so that the therapist could get to the bottom of his motivation. Apparently, Tiernan began to hate Mary because she would always tell him off for disrespecting her and her house. Mary was a very tidy woman, and she cared a lot for her house. But when Tiernan started living with her, he would eat all the food, leave his mess everywhere, and invite people in, causing even more mess for the 94-year-old Mary to clean. During their last argument, Mary outright told Tiernan that she despised him and that his presence annoyed her. This was on the day of the fire. That night, Tiernan walked from his mom's house to Mary's bungalow, knowing Mary would be asleep. He began by disabling both her smoke alarms. Then he disconnected her telephone and pushed a giant table in front of the conservatory door. This was the door Mary was found underneath of. She was trying to crawl under it to get to the door when she passed out from the smoke. Tiernan then lit a cigarette and threw it at the living room curtains, waiting for them to catch fire. Once the fire was big, he left the house and locked the front door, leaving Mary inside. Before the end of the session, Tieran's therapist alerted the police. He was arrested at his home later that day. As soon as he got arrested, Tiernan changed his story. Apparently, it had been a big misunderstanding and he had made up the story at the party. Sure, but what about confessing in front of his therapist and stepdad? When he was out of ideas, Tiernan even claimed his therapist had fabricated parts of the story. With Tiernan in jail and awaiting trial, the police would start looking into his past. Apart from a history with mental illness, they found some very disturbing evidence. Tiernan had been planning the murder for months. He had written plans to stalk and attack women, and in a diary, he kept his kill list with people's names on it. The police also examined his mobile phone and laptop. They found internet searches he'd made right after the fire. I'm a murderer, I'm a monster, I'm going to hell, I want to cause evil, urge to kill again, good alibi, I think I'm turning into a serial killer, please help. These are just some of the horrifying things Tiernan had Googled in 2018. When the police confronted Tiernan with his internet searches, he said he was just into true crime at the time. Personally, I don't think that's the usual Google search history for a true crime fan. Speaking to the police, Chris also confirmed Tiernan had been plagued by intrusive thoughts, which were very, very disturbing. When Tiernan insisted that he didn't murder Mary, the police turned to the evidence found at Mary's home: tea cakes and a can of Coke Tiernan had brought to the bungalow hours before the fire. CCTV footage also shows Tiernan buying these at a nearby patrol station that night. The most incriminating piece of evidence was Tiernan's highly detailed drawing of Mary's home. It included a plan, a checklist of the keys he had, an outline of the quickest exits, a reminder for a good alibi, and all the places where Mary kept her valuable possessions like cash and jewelry. Tiernan's trial began in November 2021, and the verdict was reached pretty soon. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, with a minimum of 15 years. The judge told Tiernan that the most worrying thing is how composed and calculating he was when planning the murder and when giving false evidence to the jury. She added, "No one could seriously think that trapping an elderly woman in a burning building was an act of mercy. Murder had been on your mind for some time. You were fascinated by serial killers and their crimes. You had dark thoughts." The judge finished her sentence with a call for empathy for the fear Mary must have experienced in the last moments of her life. It's hard to imagine the horror Mrs. Gregory must have felt when she realized her house was on fire and filling with smoke. It's the same idea Chris's brother Peter has been spending the last few months talking about.
The last 3.5 years have been traumatic for my family. We lost a loving mother, grandmother, aunt, and dear friend in horrendous circumstances. We were never satisfied that the initial findings of the coroner were accurate.
Peter went on to say that his 3 children are struggling with school because of the traumatic experience, made even more traumatic by learning that someone in the family was the killer. Furthermore, he says that he lost a brother, as Chris continues to defend Tiernan amidst all of this. "I must live with the burden that my brother did not heed the warnings from his mother to stop him going into her house, and even gave him keys." And with the thought that Tiernan is not willing to accept his responsibilities in the horror he caused, the story is even more tragic. And that is the truly upsetting case of Tiernan Darnton. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Anna Solves. Hey, don't be shy, give this video a like and subscribe. And if you can take it, why not check out our other disturbing cases? Have a good night, stay safe, and take care of each other. It's scary out there.